Hi, it's Chris Titley here. As part of the Scoreboard podcast series, I'm joined by Jim Wilson. Jim, thank you so much for being part of this series.
Yeah, pleasure. Chris, how are you?
Very well today on a sunny Brisbane day. We've had an epic sporting morning, sporting weekend. How are you going, Jim?
Yeah, good. It's that this morning with Rory and Justin Rose. You're sort of at the I sort of say it's the spiritual home of golf. I think there'll be some golf. I'd say the British Open's the spiritual home, but I mean, there's nothing like Augusta. And what a story with Rory winning. It's extraordinary story. What a climax to a great tournament.
Yes, and the 11th go at it, and then he had a good shot at the 18th and missed it, and then obviously to build himself back up for the playoff hole, one of the great sporting moments in golf, I would imagine. But we're not here to talk golf, but maybe we are. But Jim, we're here to talk a little bit about your life. Where did your interest in sport start?
Just through my grandfather more than anyone. Like my grandparents were, and my granddad was a sports nut. Like he, mad St George Illawarra fan in rugby league. Liked his VFL as it was then. Loved his cricket. Took us to all our school sports and stuff. So my granddad, Bill Hamilton, he owned a newsagent on the Gold Coast and a soul of the earth sort of guy. And my grandfather and my grandparents were huge influences on not just on me and my path to being a sports broadcaster and journo, but just me as a person in general. So yeah, I think that's where it sort of all began. And we used to sit around the living room at my grandparents' place, and my sister Rebecca was a journo, and my other sister Lizzie, she's a journalist, and Dad was a journalist. So I think journalism was in the blood. And then and Mum was actually is a school teacher, recently retired, and she was a school teacher, something like 45, 50 years. But Mum was never really into sport, but she always encouraged us to watch as much as we possibly could. She knew we loved it, and so she encouraged us to get into our sport as well. So I think from an early age, I went on a kids' TV show called Wombat at one stage, and I was 8 years of age. They came to our school in Southport on the Gold Coast, and they went around the table and they said, "Chris, what do you want to be when you grow up?" And I had mates of mine say, "I want to be a pilot. I want to be a fireman." A doctor. And then there was me who just said, "I just want to be a sports journo. I want to be a sports journalist, and I want to be a broadcaster." And that was when I was 8. So I think that predominantly I've been a sports broadcaster all my life, and obviously then I hosted my own radio show which was everything from sport, politics, everything. But I always regard myself above everything as being a journalist, and but my love of I suppose broadcasting or sport started from a very, very early age.
And Jim, do you remember your first cross? Did you get a little bit nervous?
A little bit nervous, mate. I had to change the tradies, mate. Like it was, it was daunting. I had to do, it was a bit of a sort of a tough school coming through, and it's one of the best things that ever happened to me. When I went from Channel 9 Brisbane to Channel 9 Sydney, where I replaced Mike Gibson in the sports department there, working with Kenny Sutcliffe and a few others, and Brian Henderson, the legendary newsreader, a lot of your listeners will remember him from not just 9 News in Sydney, but Bandstand and, a famous newsreader. Brian told me so. There was Brian Henderson in Sydney and Brian Naylor in Melbourne. They were two absolute doyens of newsreaders. And Hendo, when I got to Sydney, just refused to let me go on air until I had voice lessons. And I'm talking like intensive voice coaching. Mate, it lasted 2 years until Hendo gave me the green tick and the pass mark. So I eventually got on air after a couple of years. I went to a voice coach called Max Rowley, who was a pretty famous VO man, because he was actually the voiceover man for Perfect Match, which was that amazing dating show. Yeah, the dating show with Greg Evans and Debbie Newsome and Dexter. So Max Rowley was my voice coach at Chalmers Street, Redfern. And I saw Hendo years after, even after he left Nine, and I said, "Brian, you did me the greatest favour of all time, mate. It was tough at the time. It was frustrating. I was impatient. I was ambitious, but I'm glad you told me I had to get my voice right and had to do that sort of voice coaching before you let me on air. It was the best thing that ever happened to me." So, Yeah, but as far as nerves go, yeah, I mean, if you don't get nervous when you go on air, you're kidding yourself. I mean, I still, to this day, it's how you control your nerves. And if you stumble, there's nothing wrong with a stumble. It's human. But if it's making sure your stumble doesn't snowball and turn into a train wreck. But yeah, I feel comfortable in front of a microphone or camera, but I still get nervous. And the day that I don't get nervous is the day that I sort of go, you know what? I think it's time to give it away.
And Jim, radio versus TV?
Yeah, good question. Very different. I mean, it's just I love both. I mean, I've hosted 8 Olympics. I've hosted the big ticket items around the world. I still enjoy radio. It's a very it's an intimate medium. You're one-on-one with the listener, and I had a great audience at 2GB. I mean, I every day was, especially going through COVID, every day was different. And challenging. So I think in a lot of ways we were company for a lot of people. That's what radio's like. I mean, I've got my wife, Chris Barth, now hosts the Drive program on ABC Radio in Sydney, and she loves radio, she loves TV, but what we love about it, radio in particular, is it is intimate, it's personable, and during COVID, some of the stories were just tragic and horrific, like what people had to endure. And so we were able to help those people, and I was able to help, for example, people, cancer patients get across the borders to see loved ones when they're being locked out, I think completely unnecessarily. But, they were unprecedented times, weren't they? And it was sort of uncharted territory. But to be able to go and help people with campaigns, whether it be sort of helping people who were getting squeezed by councils or government and giving them a voice, was the most satisfying part of radio. So, I've been lucky. You make your own luck, and I've always had a very strong work ethic. I love what I do. To this day, with my stuff that I do at the Comms Gurus, and I'm passionate with what I do. And you've got to be passionate and enthusiastic, and you can't fool the audience with passion and enthusiasm. You can't fool the audience with empathy. You've got to be genuine and respectful and listen. And I think they're the big things that I was brought up like that by my parents, and to this day, that's my mantra. You've got to listen, and you've got to be respectful of everyone, and give people a chance to give their voice, have their opinion. And that's what I've always been about, and I'll continue to continue on that way.
And Jim, when it comes to preparation of a particular event or a live event or broadcast radio, how much time do you spend on the guest? How much time do you think about what you're going to ask and what, or plan B or plan C, as opposed to, I suppose, just winging it?
Well, I don't like winging it. I mean, sometimes you've got to wing. You got to sort of ad lib, and there'll be things that happen, breaking news, whatever, where you've just got to be. But a lot of it comes down to listening, Chris. I mean, ask my wife. I'm a pretty ordinary listener in my personal life. I think blokes are. No offence, blokes, but it's true. But I think professionally, you've got to listen. You've got to feed off your talent. You've got to listen to what they have to say. And I can't stand watching interviews where the journo or the broadcaster has got a list of questions in front of them, and they won't waver from that. They ask one question, then they're down to their clipboard to ask the next one, even though your talent or the person you're interviewing might have actually just dropped an absolute golden nugget that you should be feeding off. So preparation's vital, but you've got to also listen, and you've got to pick up on stuff during an interview and feed off your talent, because you never know what they'll say. But I went into every radio show, 3 hours of live radio every day, or went on to 8 Olympics, really prepared. Australian Open tennis, really prepared. You can't go in underdone. The viewer or the listener or the reader, and I've worked across all three forms, print, radio, TV. If you don't do your preparation, and if you don't sort of do your homework, mate, you get found out. And in particular, things like election coverages, things like Olympics, all the above, you've got to go in prepared. And if you don't, then you can absolutely get hung out to dry, and the audience can see through it. So, the audience is very smart. They're very educated, and you've got to be, got to treat them with respect. And I had a real, to this day, if I go in to train a client or a senior manager with my business at the Comms Gurus, I go in prepared. And you've got to know the audience. You've got to know who you're training, and if you do that, then you're a long way down the track. But you can't go in underdone. If you go in underdone, or if you haven't researched, if you haven't done your homework, then you will get found out and exposed.
And Jim, what's your favourite sport to prepare for?
Listen, I mean, the Olympics is fantastic. I mean, the Olympics, and I've hosted the Commonwealth Games on the Gold Coast in 2018, and I hope it was one of my career highlights. It was just a wonderful, wonderful games because I grew up on the Gold Coast and I knew the Gold Coast would do a good job with it, but it exceeded my expectations. But the Rugby League World Cup I hosted for 7 in 2017. And, I love that moment of hosting that with, Laurie Daly and Benji Marshall. That was a wonderful, wonderful tournament. The Pacific Island nations I'll never forget. And I've done Ashes series, and State of Origin in league, AFL grand finals, Anzac Day at league and AFL. They're all great highlights to me. My single favourite sporting moment would be Cathy in 2000 when Freeman won gold in the 400, and I was hosting that night, and I think about that. I think about Kieren Perkins 4 years earlier in Atlanta, going back-to-back in the 1,500 metres freestyle, coming from the slowest qualifier in lane 8 and winning back-to-back Olympic gold in the 15. So, Hackett, Thorpe, Libby Trickett, Liesl Jones, the awesome foursome, our equestrian riders, our beach volleyballers in Sydney in 2000. Cook and Pothast. There's been some really magical moments, but I'll also remember those moments too, Chris, where things didn't go to plan. Where athletes, in particular, had to face, the disappointment of missing out. Heartbreaking stories, but I'll remember those interviews as much as I'll remember the golden moments as well. How those athletes handled themselves, how they treated the media after the disappointment of missing out, and there's been a few of those over the years, and some of my most memorable interviews have been those ones where those athletes who were expected to win gold or expected to score 100 or expected to get 5 wickets or expected to star didn't and faltered. And so I remember those interviews of how those people handle themselves with some dignity and with respect as much as the real great moments in my career.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, like, looking at just a recent cricket series, I think Steve Smith at 9,999 runs at the SCG and got out and had to do it in Sri Lanka. And there's disappointments where everyone thinks that something's going to happen, but it doesn't. I'm curious to know, as in, right at the moment, sports content is changing. You're getting people like Usman Khawaja interviewed at the drinks break during a test match. You're getting closer to the game. How are you finding that? How are you adapting, as well as things like social media, where the athletes themselves are personal branding themselves as well?
Yeah, it's part of life. Social media is a huge part of what we do. I was reluctant in the social media sort of tsunami, and I've embraced sort of I'm on X, I'm on what was Twitter, and I'm on Instagram. I'm on LinkedIn. LinkedIn, I think, for business and stuff is a really important part of business and of what we do. But I think, as far as, the sideline interviews and you mentioned Uzi Khawaja and stuff, I think it's wonderful. I think it's giving, rugby league players being interviewed at halftime, or an AFL player being interviewed at halftime, or a coach pre-game, moments before, a team runs out. I think it gives the fan and the listener or the watch or the viewer, it takes them right into the inner sanctum. And I think that's great. It's come such a long way. Technology, social media, as you mentioned, but there's so many ways that people are getting their information now, and to have that insight from an athlete just before, during competition or pre-competition or post-competition, it just adds another dimension and takes the fan even closer to the action in the moment. So I say, I'm all for it.
And Jim, with technology progressing, as we've just talked about, and social media, etc., there would be more data. There would be more points to talk about with particular players. Can you talk about the discrepancy, I suppose, from when you were beginning as a journalist to where you are now in regards to the access to data and some of the points that you might pick up and that others might not?
I like the human factor of sport and the human element. Data's great and stats are great, and I like a good stat. But I just think sometimes it gets laborious. Like I look at some of it and I go, just call the game, will you? And I'm not being critical of my colleagues. Like, you know, there's some really great callers and broadcasters who I have a huge amount of respect for. You know, and you know, even someone like Bruce McAvaney. Now, Bruce, I've done Olympics together. We go back a long way, and he's, you know, really been a great friend and someone who I respect enormously professionally. Now, we talk about data and stats. Well, Bruce is the stats king, right? But he makes it sound interesting and not just a regurgitating of numbers. And I think that's the fine line. I find some callers in particular, they're just so stats driven. And I get, you know, we want to know, you know, tackles or metres gained or whatever. But you know what? Footy's not that complicated. It's not rocket science. And the human element and the human stories that be told, you know, some callers just do it brilliantly. But I feel like some sort of use stats and data as a bit of a clutch to get out of to a degree, a bit of laziness, and it's so predictable. And it can be too stats heavy, and I want to watch the footy, and the best commentators, in particular on TV, are the ones that let the pictures and the sound tell the story. You know, you think about Richie Benaud. You know, Richie Benaud was all about less is more, less is best, economising of words, sense of timing, you know, measured pause, the whole bit. And so that, to me, that's the art of broadcasting. And, you know, I've never had one viewer or listener, Chris, say to me, Jim, can you say more?
Yes. Yeah.
You know, well, it's true. You know, and especially if I'm excited or if there's something breaking or a big ticket item, let's go live to Cathy Freeman's goal, you know, the adrenaline starts racing and you start quickening up your pace and you start trying to bombard the viewer with stats and info. Just let the moment tell the story. You know, it's a pictures medium, TV, and I find that the best callers are the ones that say the least amount of words, and and when they do say something, it's not just regurgitated stats or data. Yes, it's a necessary part. I love analysis. I love all that, but especially with live sport, I just want to watch the moment. Watch the story unfold. Give us some background. Give us value add as far as, hey, where's this person come from? What's the backstory? And every athlete's got a great backstory. Same with politicians when you're doing, rather than just regurgitating the usual stuff, let's have something human, a human interest angle. And I'm very big on that. I don't think that should be underestimated. I think the audience loves that as well.
And Jim, talking about the Cathy Freeman moment, how would you approach that? I see commentators and journalists all the time when something happens and they go straight to it, and the first question is, "How do you feel?" Would you do that?
That should be banned. That should be banned from any journo or broadcaster's copybook. How do you feel? And I was told this by a former head of sport, actually, a guy called Saul Stein, who was a great head of sport that I had at 7. And Saul was mastermind of Wide World of Sports at 9. Was a great sports director at 7. And Saul said to me from early days, he said, Jimmy, just please don't say, how do you feel? What do you mean, how do you feel? I mean, if someone's just won or someone's just lost or someone's just been knocked out and you go to a teammate and you go, well, how do you feel? Well, I mean, it's just, again, a lazy question, a lazy, predictable question and cliched. And what do you mean, how do you feel? You just won gold.
Captain Obvious, yep.
Yeah, correct. Exactly right. And I rather than, I mean, this is a moment you've been dreaming of, Cathy. Your family, your friends here. What do you say to them, and what do you say to the fans here and around the country? There's other ways of pitching it that can also sum up their emotion without saying, "How do you feel?" Yep. Like the only time I liked "How do you feel," there used to be an old Tooheys beer ad. And I don't know if you remember, but how do you feel when you're and they had Mike Whitney in it and Big Bird Joel Garner, West Indian, fantastic bowler. They were all in this ad, and that's the only time I don't mind. How do you feel? Yes. You know, I feel like a Tooheys, and it was done to this cricket ad with some cricketing greats. That's the only time "How do you feel" should be used.
I remember the cricket ad growing up was "We love it up here." 4X. We had Alan Border on. Oh
yeah,
remember that one?
That's right. Yeah, that was good. That
we
was
love
good.
it up here. I can even do the jingle still. There you go. Yeah.
Yeah.
With Alan Border at the end.
What was the other one with 4X? I can feel
a 4X coming on.
coming on.
That's it. I can
Got
feel
the taste
for it. Just
it.
can't wait for it.
Just wait for it. Yeah, mate. Isn't it amazing how things like that, though, they stick with you? And it's great jingles, and it's one of those things where I go, yeah. But going back to your original question, no, I'm certainly not a fan of being Captain Obvious and saying, "How do you feel?"
And when it comes to athlete access, have you come across different varyings of people around wanting to talk to you, not wanting to talk to you, and you're building your reputation through, obviously, as a younger journalist broadcaster, that people will give access to you as opposed to someone else?
Yeah, I think that comes with years of experience and credibility. And I'll go back to the key word here, respect. I've had to do some really hard interviews over the years where with people I regard as being not just elite athletes, but good friends of mine. And I've had to do the really good questions, but there's been times, for example, with Shane Warne, who I was very good mates with. I said, Warne, there's been times in his life and career that I had to go and ask the hard question. But people like Warne, they respected that I had a job to do. They didn't always agree with me, but they knew and respected I had a job to do. And that we were friends to the day that he tragically passed away. And because the respect was two ways. There's been other athletes and people over the years, politicians, in particular around election time when I was, especially the last election, the federal election, where, people who I got on pretty well with, who I had to ask the hard question. I had to make them accountable. They didn't like that. It affected our relationship in some ways. But the ones who knew that I had a job to do, they respected the fact that I had a job to do. And I think, as going back to what you said, I think being around and doing this for a while, I think that it's one of those things where I think you gain respect, and you get you get people on side purely through years of experience, and knowing that. And just knowing that the key word is being respectful and dignified, and not being aggressive. But if you have to ask the hard question, you have to ask the hard question. That's part of the gig.
And Jim, you touched on friendship there with athletes and commentators, etc. How close is it? Is it a grey area sometimes when you are really friends with someone and something does go a bit wrong and you do have to cover it?
There's a line you don't. There is a line, and I think that. I've emceed and hosted elite athletes, good mates' weddings, for example, or milestones. And then a week or 2 weeks later, scandal breaks, crisis breaks, big yarn breaks, and I'm there asking a hard question. And, again, I go back to the point, Chris, that the ones who are respectful, they get it. They get it. That's part of my job. And it would be remiss of me, and this is what I'm talking about, the line. If I have to ask the hard question, I have to ask the hard question. But I think it's also, I'd like to think that throughout my career, I haven't always just been a journo or a broadcaster, and I've been very big on this. And who are just looking for clickbait and looking for that gotcha headline, or I'm glass half full. I want to be positive. If someone does well, we should praise them. Male or female, and our women's sports, our women's athletes are just flying and have been flying for years, and they deserve recognition. So I'm very big on giving them that recognition, and celebrating their success. And I think that women's sport in particular, and this is not just sounding woke or politically correct as some people might process it as, it's not about that. It's about actually celebrating wonderful performances by our athletes, and our female athletes in particular, and male or female. I think, we should be, there's a lot of great stories to tell in this country, and a lot of athletes we can celebrate who are really great ambassadors and role models. And I think we should acknowledge that, and also pay tribute to them.
No, I agree 100%. I'm interested in your views around the fan behaviour, the consumer, I suppose, of sport since you began journalism and broadcasting to where you are now, in regards to positivity and negativity and celebrating success, and we're getting boos while people do conversions and things which may not have happened many years ago. I'm interested to know your comment on the consumer now.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I was at the tennis this year, and I was pretty disappointed with the crowd behaviour. I think that, as far as the movement behind a goal, or people trying to put them off behind the goal when they're trying to kick a goal in the AFL, or a conversion in rugby league, that's part and parcel of it. They're elite athletes. You've got to be able to cope with distractions. But there's a line that you don't cross. And at the tennis this year, and the Australian Open's one of my favourite things on the calendar. I just love the Aussie Open. It's a great, great event. Not just a sports event, it's a great event. But the behaviour of some at the tennis was just appalling. Cheering double faults, celebrating an opponent's failure, rowdiness, yelling out expletives, trying to put the player off. I think it was really un-Australian. And I think that certainly I was speaking to a number of people like Pat Cash and people who have been around the game for a long time, and they said this is the worst crowd behaviour that we've seen at any, not just Grand Slam tennis tournament, at any tennis tournament around the globe. And I think when you've got people, Tennis Australia, who do a really good job and a fantastic job at promoting the event, they weren't happy with the crowd behaviour. There's no doubt they weren't happy with it, because I think there's an element, and it's a minority, Chris, it's a minority. They go along to a sporting event purely to be a pest, and they don't go with the right intentions. The majority of us just go and celebrate it and rejoice and have a great time. But there's a real minority who just go along to be serial agitators and pests, and they're not into the sport. They're just there to agitate. And it's really disappointing because, I get people will be rowdy and support Nick Kyrgios. I love, that's the Aussie patriotic side, sort of fervour. But there's a line, and I think the line was crossed well and truly by a minority, and that shouldn't go and mean all of us get tarred with the same brush, but it was pretty ordinary behaviour, and at times appalling behaviour that I certainly wasn't proud of, and it left a bad taste in my mouth. And I think certainly if people want to go along to a sporting event, go along, cheer your lungs out. Fine, we love that. We love the passion. But, hey, don't just go along to be a pest.
I've got one final question, Jim, around sport in general in Australia. What's sport given you that nothing else has?
That's a really good question. I think just it's given me a great life. The amount of different people I've met around the world, and and also not just through sport. I think just broadcasting in general. I mean, I go back to my drive program on 2GB that I loved every day, because every day was different. It was a variety of stuff, from sport to politics to, obviously during COVID, it was a really busy news cycle, and I met some amazing individuals. The individuals and the people, and people who have got like a hard luck story, or people who need a help, or a great athlete who's just done something unbelievably fantastic, or someone who's missed out and who conduct themselves with so much dignity and humility and pride and respect. I remember those moments vividly. And so, it's given me so much. It's, I said I've been broadcasting close to 40 years, and I still get out of bed, and I still, love what I do. I love the fact that I'm now training, chief executives or senior management and how to be better communicators, how to connect with the audience, how to cut through with the audience by just using real speak, by being authentic. Authenticity is such a big part of it. You've got to be authentic. The viewer and the listener and the reader can see through if you're not authentic, if you're not real. They just go, oh, come on, you just manufactured gobbledygook. Be real. Be real, for God's sake. They're not fools, and just want to be there. That's the big thing. So, authenticity and some great moments in close to 40 years of broadcasting and journalism, and it's. It ain't over yet, mate. Still good fun.
Jim Wilson, thank you so much for being part of the Scoreboard podcast. I really do appreciate your time. Thank you for telling your story, some of the highs and some of the lows, and all the moments in between. Look forward to catching up. All the best with the business and the media training, etc., and looking forward to keeping an eye on the progress.
www.thecomsgurus.com.au. There you go. A bit of a free plug at the end.
Absolutely.
Chris, thank you for your time, mate. And thanks for your passion too, mate. I love your podcast. Good on you.
Thank you.